Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight. It is Glenn Rawson, and Sunday night, May 4th, 2025. Welcome to our devotional tonight. I wanted to thank you for joining me, being here as you so frequently are, and I wanted to give you a report. I came back just yesterday from a 3-day tour of Martin's Cove. Dennis Lyman and I went out there and spent 3 days with about 40 wonderful people on a bus tour with Teton Stage Lines. We went out to Casper and came back along the Pioneer Trail, talking about the Willie and Martin Handcart companies and the rescue. We had a wonderful time. And in that regard, I decided, because it was just so fresh on my mind, that I would share some stories that took place along that trail as pertaining to Willie and Martin Handcart companies and the rescue. So that'll be the theme of the fireside tonight, are the Handcart people of 1856. Now, just so that you know, the next one of these 3-day Martin's Cove tours will be on the 20th of October later on this year. If you're interested in that, go to glenrawsonstories.com and the information will be right there. I also wanted to mention tonight, before I get into this, I don't know, it's been on my mind lately, but if you have any inspirational stories, miracle stories, or events, conversion stories, things that have happened in your life that are appropriate to share with others, please send them to me, Glenn at glenrawsonstories.com. Let me share your inspiration with other people if it's appropriate. All right? All right, tonight, again, tell me where you're watching from, how many of you are watching, and somewhere towards the end of this whole thing, would you tell me which of these stories was your favorite? That helps me know which ones to publish for the weekly stories. All right, and lastly, I invite you to have a prayer in your heart for me and for those that are listening tonight, that the Spirit of the Lord will be here. This first story takes place near Casper, Wyoming. What is modern day Casper, Wyoming? Those of you that know anything about that trail, one of the significant places where the actual tragedy really began for the Martin Company was at the last crossing of the Platte River near what is today modern day Casper, Wyoming. The Martin Company had come all the way from Iowa City, across the Missouri River, all the way across Nebraska, following the Platte. And all that while they had grown weaker from lack of food and overexertion, lack of calories. And now, on the 19th of October, they arrived at the last crossing of the Platte River. To appreciate what that crossing was like, you need to come with Dennis and I out there and we'll show it to you. But this story culminates right there. All right? Heber McBride was a lad from England who loved adventure. Because of the stories that his grandfather had told him, he dreamed of going to sea. And no matter how much his parents tried to change his mind, Heber would not give up that dream. Finally, in hopes of giving him a real taste of the sea and to talk him out of it, Heber's parents put him on a boat for a 2-week voyage to Ireland and back. "We had such a rough trip," Heber said of that, "but it made me want to be a sailor more than ever." Well, the McBride family joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and set their sights on sailing for America, which they did on the ship Horizon in May of 1856. Now, for most, the journey across the sea on those ships was a horrible adventure. But for Heber, who wanted to be a sailor, why, it was the adventure of a lifetime. He said, "I was delighted at the thought of being on the water in such a big ship. It was all fun and pleasure for me. I was in and out of everything and kept my parents in hot water," he said. Now, he may have been the only person on that ship that really wanted to be there, and who was sorry when they finally came in sight of New York Harbor. Well, after the McBrides got off the boat in New York, they then made their way by train to Iowa City, Iowa, where they were then assigned as part of the Martin Handcart Company. As they crossed Nebraska and much of Wyoming, both of Heber's parents became ill, too sick to pull the handcart. The burden of caring for the family and for the 3 younger children fell to Heber, who at that time I believe was 13, and his older sister Janetta, who was 19. It became a daily routine for the McBride family that both sick parents would leave ahead of the handcart train and walk as far as they could. And when their strength gave out, they would lie down and wait for the rest of the company. When Heber and Janetta came upon their parents lying alongside the trail, they would load them up and they would pull them on down the trail, the ailing parents taking turns riding in the handcart. Quote, "No tongue or pen could tell what my sister and I passed through. Our parents both so sick and us so young." End quote. 6-year-old Peter McBride remembered the sacrifices of his older sister. He said, "She carried water from the river to do the cooking. Her shoes gave out and she walked through the snow barefoot, actually leaving bloody tracks in the snow." End quote. It was October 19th, 1856, when the McBride family, along with the rest of the Martin Company, reached the last crossing of the Platte River. Now, in spite of his weakness, Robert McBride, the father, got his family across the river and then went back to help others. He didn't have the strength to do it. And according to some accounts, 25 times he walked across the deep, freezing, ice-choked waters of the Platte River. That service would cost Robert McBride his life near Red Butte's camp. Well, the next morning, the Martin Company made it only a short distance when the snow continued to come down so heavy it forced them to make camp. Heber put his ailing father in a sick wagon to help him along, and then Heber picked up the handcart and went on. As darkness fell, Heber searched for his father in the wagon, but he couldn't find him. The next morning, again, this is between the last crossing and Red Butte's camp, the snow lay 18 inches deep on the ground. Heber went out again to search for his dad. He found him under a wagon, covered in snow, stiff and dead. Heber said, "I felt as though my heart would burst. I sat down beside him on the snow and took hold of one of his hands and cried, 'Oh, Father, Father.'" End quote. Heber goes on to describe that after I had my cry out, I went back to the tent and told Mother. To try to right the feelings of Mother and the other children is out of the question. Heber watched as they buried his father in a common grave with 12 others. The boy who craved adventure got more than his share and became a man before his time. Heber and Janetta would deliver their family safely into Salt Lake City, November 30th, 1856. Come with me back on the trail with this tour, and I'll show you where these things happened. Next story. The date was Sunday, November the 9th, 1856. The place, about 50 to 60 miles farther to the west from the last crossing of the Platte. a place called Martin's Cove, Wyoming. That's where this story occurred. It was on this date that the awful winter weather abated somewhat that had forced the immigrants into Martin's Cove. And now on November 9th, they were coming out of the cove and the shelter of the cove to begin the last leg of their journey into Salt Lake City. Some of them were able to ride in the newly procured rescue wagons provided by the Hunt and Hodgett wagon trains. Others of the immigrants had to walk, but nearly all of them were so weak and sickly that many couldn't walk. They abandoned their handcarts and rode in the wagons, as many as could possibly fit in. On the morning that the wagons rolled out of Martin's Cove, bound for Salt Lake City, some 325 miles away, Josiah Rogerson was one of the immigrants. He was there and one of the last to come out of the cove. And he relates the following, quote, "One of the young ladies whose mind became affected by the fatal crossing, meaning the last crossing of the Platte River, had left her own campfire immediately after the last relief wagon had rolled out from here in the snow on the morning of Sunday, November 9th. Apparently, she went in search of some scraps of food or meat and had got to a fire round a point in the rocks near to where my brother and I were roasting some pieces of meat and rawhide for lunch. As we arose to go and catch the wagons," meaning the rescue wagons that are leaving for Salt Lake, "we caught sight of the young woman sitting at the fire and staring at us with dazed eyes. We tried to rouse her from her lethargy, but she was all childish indifference," he said. "Sending my brother ahead to stop the last wagon, he returned, and making a chair of our arms, we carried her a rod or two at a time for a couple of 100 yards, as she was not able to walk. And the teamster coming to our relief, she soon was placed in his wagon. In this early part of our journey, she ranked as one of the most beautiful girls in face, tall and well-formed in the company. And had we not discovered her when we did, the chances are that in less than an hour, she would have met her death as Father Stone did, a feast for the mountain wolves." She was then about 20 years of age. Succeeding in reaching Utah with us, she recovered her mind by kind nursing that winter, and in the spring or summer following, married one of the most prominent and well-to-do first settlers of Ogden City. End of quote. Josiah Rogerson. That young woman was Mary Horrocks, a convert from England traveling with her sister, Elizabeth Horrocks Jackson. Indeed, Mary did go on to the Salt Lake Valley. She did settle in Ogden. She did marry a prospering attorney named Nathaniel Levitt, and together Mary and Nathaniel had 12 children. Can you imagine how many descendants they have now who call her blessed? But think about it. What if on that cold winter day at Martin's Cove, Josiah and his brother had turned a blind eye to her suffering? What if they had weighted their own needs greater than hers and just left her there to fend for herself? How many lives today would be radically different? Stories and accounts of what happened at Martin's Cove, at the last crossing of the Platte, at Devil's Gate, they're in this book. If you're going out on trek this year, I recommend it to you. It's called Journal of the Handcart Pioneers. You can get it at Deseret Book. And as you can see, this is my trail copy. It's well used. Or you can get it at historyofthesaints.org. This is where the pioneers speak for themselves. Okay? Next story. Just right there at Devil's Gate is an old fort called Fort Seminole. Now, the original fort is gone. It was burned down. But missionaries rebuilt a replica of it not too far from where the original fort stood. This story takes place at Old Fort Seminole. John Cooper was born in Leicestershire, England, the son of James and Anne North Cooper. When John was only 2 years old, his father was killed. His mother was unable to care for him, and she sent him to live with a wealthy uncle who provided much of the world's goods and a quality education. His uncle also insisted that John learn a trade, and so John became a skilled cobbler. He was described as a nice-looking man with brown eyes and dark, wavy hair. He stood 5'10" tall and weighed about 160 to 170. He was very athletic and took part in all kinds of the sports of his day. He was one of the fastest foot racers in all of England. In fact, it is said that he even ran before the Queen, etc., etc. Well, one day, he and his friends stopped to hear some street preachers. John said the words of the preachers and the songs that they sang kept ringing in his ears, and he couldn't erase them from his mind. Well, to make a long story short, John Cooper joined the Church of Jesus Christ, and in so doing, was disinherited by his uncle and kicked out. From 1854 to 1856, John served as a missionary right there in his native England. He met Mary Ann Lewis. They fell in love and decided they wanted to get married, but they decided that they would wait until they reached Zion, where they could then be sealed by proper priesthood authority. Well, John and Mary came to Iowa City, and as fate would have it, they were assigned to be a part of the Hodgetts, the Ben Hodgetts Wagon Company. That is the wagon company that traveled between the Willie Company and the First, the Martin Company, then the Hodgett Company, and then the Hunt Company at the very back. So the Hodgett Wagon Company is rolling along in tandem or close to the Martin Handcart Company. They're right there at the same time. And as I mentioned earlier, when the winter snows came in October of 1856, John was part of those 4 companies stranded out there in what would later be described as one of the worst Wyoming winters in memory. Those companies, of course, Willie and Martin, Hunt and Hodgett again. Well, when the Martin Company and the Hodgett Company were up in Martin's Cove sheltering from the awful winter storms that were hitting them, the decision was made by the rescuers that we've got to get these people out. We've got to get them to Salt Lake, but they're too weak to walk. How are we going to do this? So the decision was made to take the personal goods and freight out of the wagons that belonged to the Hunt and Hodgett companies and store those goods in Old Fort Seminole for safekeeping. A meeting was called to decide now that the goods were inside the buildings of the fort, how are we going to protect those goods? 20 men were asked to remain behind through the rest of the winter, from November clear through to May, and guard those goods. John Cooper was one of those asked to remain, and he answered the call in the affirmative. He agreed to stay and let his fiancée go on to Salt Lake. Captain Grant, the chief of the rescuers, said to them, that it was a great trust reposed in those men to remain. He wanted them to guard and care for it more so than if it belonged to them individually. He wanted no half or chicken-hearted men, he said, to remain, but men with large souls, men of integrity, men of God who would not do a wrong thing and would not steal from one another. If any such were among them, he wanted them to be passed through the devil's gate, and he did not want any grumblers or fault finders. He believed the men remaining were good men and would not go to do anything wrong. John was among them. Now, in regards to food and survival, you got to come with me. If you haven't been there, you got to come out and see this. How were they supposed to survive? The Martin Company had no food. In regards to their shortage of food that they knew would happen, Captain Grant anticipated, yes, they would have hard times, but they need have no fear of starving. They could go out and kill buffalo or antelope. Well, there aren't any out there at that time of the year. That assessment proved overly optimistic as the winter drew on. The family records say that the cattle that these guards had became so poor and were dying so fast that they killed them to save them for food. One man among them was an expert butcher, and he prepared the meat, expecting to eat only the best and keep the rest of it for wolf bait. But the wolves didn't get any of it. The men were obliged to eat every bit of the meat themselves, even the hides and the hoofs. They suffered with cold and hunger. They dug under the snow for onions and sagos. Their rawhides were scalded to take the hair off, and then they were cooked and eaten by the men to keep from starving. They were in a starving condition, and many of them were very sick because of eating the coarse food. John said that their constant prayer was that God would bless their stomach and adapt them to the kind of food they were forced to eat. When help finally arrived that spring, the men had their saddle straps, latigo straps, soaking and preparing to cook so that they could eat it. The men were so thin, they could hardly walk. John Cooper went into Fort Seminole answering the call, weighing 160 pounds. He came out of the fort the following spring, weighing 80 pounds. John did not make it into the valley to meet his sweetheart again until June 6th, 1857. 2 days after arriving in the valley, he married Mary Ann in the endowment house. He had proven himself a man able to do hard things. John would later write, quote, "We must not expect everything to run smooth," end of quote. Very wise counsel indeed. Let's take a break. Now, I got home on Saturday night. I'll be home today, Sunday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I'll be with family. And then on Friday, I fly out again with Fun for Less Tours. And by this time next week, I'll probably be somewhere in New York near Palmyra. And there I will be teaching church history to 2 more buses of people with Fun for Less Tours. I love to teach church history. So just to let you know, that's where I'll be next week, is somewhere near Palmyra and Manchester. Now, there are 2 more tours coming up that I dare say none of you have been on. One of them is a Mormon Battalion tour, and the other is a Pioneer Trail tour from Nauvoo to Salt Lake City. Both of those tours are rich in church history and the story of heroes and heroines that we just don't talk enough about. These people follow the Savior, just like you do. The Savior's involved in the lives of common people. And I'm going out on these tours, Mormon Battalion through California and the Pioneer Trail from Nauvoo to Salt Lake, to tell you the stories of common, ordinary people who, by faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, accomplished very uncommon and extraordinary things. I'm inviting you to come. If you'd like to come on either the Mormon Battalion tour or the Pioneer Trail tour, go to glenrawsonstories.org, glenrawsonstories.com. And if you would like to come with me next year on one of these church history tours from Nauvoo from Palmyra to Carthage and Nauvoo, go to funforlesstours.com. Okay? Now, this next story, let me step back. When we were out there on Friday, we drove our group to Devil's Gate, and we took them through the Martin's Cove Visitor Center, and the missionaries were wonderful, so helpful. And then from there, we drove down the road a couple of miles and unloaded the bus, and those who were able to followed me over to Martin's Cove. And there, I showed them the crossing site where they crossed the Sweetwater River in order to get up into Martin's Cove. And it's one thing to hear the stories about the young men carrying the people of the Martin Company across that terrible river in the winter of 56. But to see that river is to get a whole new perspective on this. And to look up into that cove and visualize that cove filled with hundreds of people struggling to survive. You got to come and see it. You can read about it all you want, but reading about it is like getting a kiss through a screen door. It's nice, but you're missing something. You got to come see. You got to come see what Martin's Cove is really like and hear the stories of the people that were there. For example, this one. Cyrus Hubbard Wheelock was born February 28, 1813 in Henderson, New York, the son of Asa and Lucy Hubbard Wheelock. Cyrus was baptized a member of the church in September 1839 and shortly after called as a missionary to Vermont. He distinguished himself in June of 1844 for his service to the prophet Joseph Smith just before the prophet's martyrdom in Carthage jail. After that, Cyrus was called as a missionary to England in June 1846. While he was gone, his wife passed away. In 1854, from here in Utah, Cyrus was called again to go back to England, this time to serve as a counselor to the mission president, Elder Franklin D. Richards. And then in 1856, Cyrus was once again, as a returning missionary, called to assist with the immigration of almost 3,000 saints to America and on to Utah. Cyrus arrived in Florence, Nebraska, just in time to assist the Martin Handcart Company to resupply and jump off onto the plains for their final journey to Salt Lake. And then Cyrus, Elder Richards, and others, traveling in light wagons and buggies, went all the way ahead. They passed the Martin Company. They passed the Willie Company and the Hunt and Hodgetts, and they arrived in Salt Lake City well ahead of them on October 4th, 1856. They reported to President Brigham Young and then informed him that there were yet 4 immigrant companies still out on the plains. No one knew that they were there. And it caused an alarm with President Young. They shouldn't be there and they must be brought in immediately. And he called for volunteers. And so on the morning of October 7th, 1856, when the first teams of wagons, 16 wagons and 27 men, went out onto the plains for the rescue, 43-year-old Cyrus Wheelock left and went with them. He had just come home from an extended mission overseas. And notwithstanding his large family and having been away for so long, he answered the call, he volunteered, and he went back out to rescue those he loved more than his own life. Notwithstanding the blizzards and the extreme cold, Cyrus was one of the first 4 advance rescue riders who found the Willie Company, gave them hope and encouragement to get up and keep moving to the west. As some of the rescuers turned west to help the Willie Company into the valley, Cyrus did not come back. He stayed out in the winter of Wyoming and went on to the east to find the Martin Company and the Hunt and Hodgett. He helped them cross the Sweetwater that day, up into Martin's Cove, November 1st and 2nd, 1856, where the Martin Company would remain snowbound in the desolate wilderness of Martin's Cove for the next 5 days. Now, visualize Martin's Cove if you can, and picture it filled with tents and campfires burning around, and huddled, shivering, starving, freezing, dying saints. And there's only a handful of rescuers, so willing, but so able to do so little. In that awful wilderness, it was still the custom of the saints to gather for prayer under those difficult circumstances. One evening, as the Martin Company gathered for evening prayer, Josiah Rogerson of the Martin Company recorded this. Elder Cyrus H. Wheelock, who had just returned from a 3-year mission to the British Isles, during which time he became greatly attached to scores in our camp and company, offered a very remarkable prayer. His heart and soul was filled with sorrow at our condition, as we had several in our camp, yet that had to a certain extent lost their minds since the crossing of the North Platte River. They became like children and impersonal. And then he goes on to talk about what Cyrus did. Raising his hands to heaven in a very impressive and appealing manner, his voice near stifled with emotion and grief, he prayed to the Father that if for any fault or weakness that he might have done or committed in his life and ministry, the progress of the members of our company that he loved dearer than his own life was impeded. That if through anything he had done or left undone, he had caused or helped to cause or bring about our present plight, that God would instantly remove him out of the way by death and let the company go on without further loss to the valleys of the mountains. It was touching and deep in its humility, and this brief digest will no doubt refresh the memories and reproduce the scene in that snowbound camp for many of our surviving comrades. End of quote. This was not overblown drama or fast and testimony meeting dramatics. No. When the rescuers finally did come out on November the 9th and took the Martin Company out of the cove and set out for the valley, they ran headlong into more storms that threatened those already suffering saints. Cyrus was driving one of the wagons, and they ran into the snowstorms. Nathan Hunting was there and recorded that Brother Wheelock understood that if they couldn't stop the storms, that the sick and weary would continue to die. So as soon as they saw the storm, Cyrus stopped the wagon and prayed to God for help that the course of the storm be changed. No sooner did he end the prayer and start the team forward when the storm stopped and the wind blew from their backs, cutting a clear path for them all the way to Salt Lake City. Cyrus Hubbard Wheelock has been mostly forgotten for what he did then. His name has been forgotten, and the heroic deeds he did have been forgotten by most. But you all know who he is. He wrote a song while serving as a missionary in 1849. And those words that he wrote still live on with vigor to this day. And it inspires the elders of Israel still. He wrote, "Ye elders of Israel, come join now with me and seek out the righteous where'er they may be, in desert, on mountain, on land, or on sea, and bring them to Zion, the pure and the free. O Babylon, we bid thee farewell. We're going to the mountains of Ephraim to dwell." And now, considering all that Cyrus did in the great rescue of 1856, the third verse of that hymn has now added and a special meaning. He wrote, "We'll go to the poor like our captain of old, and visit the weary, the hungry and cold. We'll cheer up their hearts with the news that he bore, and point them to Zion and life evermore." An ordinary man who answered the call and did extraordinary things. Do we love God that much? Are we that willing to answer the call and love and minister? Are we that dedicated? I pray we are. Just like Cyrus Hubbard Wheelock. Next story. If any of you listening to me have ever been to Rocky Ridge or to Rock Creek Hollow, can you see them? Can you remember? The story takes place there. I wonder sometimes, by way of introduction, if when those around us make a mistake or manifest a weakness, we somehow brand them with it, and we let that weakness or mistake ever after define who that person is. We do not allow them to change. We do not allow the Savior's atonement to make them a different person. Let me show you what I mean. Go back to August 13th, 1856, Florence, Nebraska. The Willie Handcart Company faced a crucial decision. Should they push on to the Salt Lake Valley 1,000 miles ahead, or should they stay there and winter over along the Missouri River where it was relatively safe? It was a high drama meeting because there was so much at stake there. Levi Savage, one of the sub-captains, stood up and spoke to the group and later recorded the following. Brother Millen Atwood said to me last night that since he'd been a member of this church with all of his experience, he had never been placed in a position where things appeared so dark to him as it does to take this company through at this late season of the year. And then in the meeting, Levi was invited to speak, and this is what he said. He said that Captain Willie invited him to speak his mind. And Levi said, I spoke to him that if I spoke, I must speak my mind, let it cut where it would. And he said, certainly, do so. And then Levi said, I then related to the saints the hardships we should have to endure. I said that we were liable to have to wade in snow up to our knees and should at night wrap ourselves in a thin blanket and lie on the frozen ground without a bed. I spoke warmly upon the subject, but I spoke truth, and the people, judging from appearances and after expressions, felt the force of it. George Cunningham was there and attested to the emotion by which Levi spoke. But what's interesting here is that Levi Savage spoke in direct opposition to what the other leaders were counseling. Captain Willie told the people to go ahead, to trust in God and move forward against the storms. Well, in the end, the Willie Company voted to go. Well, Levi Savage was voted down. Now, fast forward to October 19th, 1856, near the 5th crossing of the Sweetwater between Devil's Gate, Martin's Cove, and Rocky Ridge. The last ration of food was issued by Captain Willie to his company. There was nothing left to sustain the camp, and they were more than 200 miles from Salt Lake. The company stopped at noon to rest. It started to snow. Could their situation have been any more desperate? They were out of food, malnourished to the point of death, without adequate clothing or shelter, on one of the most exposed high elevation portions of the entire trail, and again, 250 miles from civilization. There was no Walmart over the next hill. And now it was snowing, hard, cold, and wind-driven. Just then, 4 riders came into camp with news that there were wagons filled with supplies only a day or two ahead. Get up. Keep going, those riders urged. The Willie Company got up, struggled on another 12 miles, while those rescue riders went on to the east looking for the Martin Company. The Willie Company camped that night at the 6th crossing of the Sweetwater. It took until nearly 10 p.m. that night to get everyone that added distance on to 6th crossing. And that night, it snowed another foot. The next morning, October 20th, 1856, the weather was bitterly cold, and now the camp was out of food entirely. Where were those rescue wagons? And it was then that Captain James G. Willie made a fateful decision. He was going to go find those rescue wagons and urge them along to the camp. He took Joseph Benson Elder with them, and off they rode into the storm. They rode about 12 miles to the base of Rocky Ridge. The wagons weren't there. They continued on over Rocky Ridge another 14 miles. And all of this on horseback in the face of snow and an awful cold wind. And finally, just at nightfall, by the miracle of a well-placed sign by Harvey Clough, they found those needed rescue wagons who did not know their desperate circumstances. Under Captain Willie's urging, the rescuers hitched up the next morning and went hard for the Sweetwater River, arriving in the Willie Company camp just at sunset. Mary Huron, who was there, said it best, "They came just in time to save our lives." End of quote. Of Captain James G. Willie, George Cunningham said, "Our captain did his duty. He was badly frozen and came very close to dying. He showed all of us a noble example. We all loved Captain Willie," wrote Mary Huron. "He was kind and considerate and did all that he could do for the comfort of those in his company." In the end, 74 people in the Willie Company perished, and many more would have had it not been for the heroic ride into a blizzard of Captain Willie and Joseph Elder. And yet, it is Captain Willie, that same leader, who urged his people to have faith and push on to Florence, the same one who challenged and insulted Levi Savage. He was in large part the reason the Handcart people were out there in the first place. Now, I am grateful that history has deservedly judged this man not a villain, but a hero. For surely he was. Notwithstanding the mistake that he made, he proved himself a better man. I mean, after all, think about it. With faith in the atonement of the Lord Jesus Christ, our mistakes need not and should not define us, nor should we allow them to define others, living or dead. Brothers and sisters, if we really believe in the atonement of Jesus Christ, let your mistakes go and let the mistakes of others go as well. Let them become something great. This last story takes place at Rocky Ridge, at Rock Creek Hollow, and pertains to the Willie Company. October 23rd, 1856. William James was asked to help bury the dead that morning before the Willie Company began the ascent of Rocky Ridge. William and his family were part of the Willie Company, and as I've already said, snow had caught them, it was deep, and it was cold. Well, that morning, William and his 13-year-old son, Reuben, remained behind to complete the grim duty of burying the dead. Once they finished, the younger James children ran on up ahead to catch up with the rest of the Willie Company. The mother, Jane, picked up the handcart and along with Reuben and William and started to pull to catch up with the company. Well, they didn't go far before the father, William, collapsed into the snow. He tried several times to get up. He couldn't. Mary Ann James, who was at that time just 11 years old, would later write, "Mother was placed in an awful position. Her husband, William, was unable to go any further, and her little children far ahead, hungry and freezing. What can she do?" And father said, "Go to the children. We will get in if we can." End of quote. While Reuben remained with his father, Jane James pushed on and found her children huddled against the bank of the Sweetwater River, too frightened and too tired to cross alone. The daughter, Sarah, later wrote, "We had forded this river many times before, but it had never seemed so far across. It was about 40 feet to the other bank, but Mother soon had us on our way." End quote. Sometime that night, Jane James and her children reached camp at Rock Creek and anxiously turned their faces back up the trail in anticipation. Where was Father? Where was Reuben? With each group that came in, they expected to see them. All night they waited, and still they did not come. Finally, towards morning, some of the captains, Levi Savage, William Woodward, Millen Atwood, had gone out to bring in the last of the stragglers. As they did, they rolled into camp with the wagon carrying the dead, frozen body of William James and the badly frozen and barely conscious Reuben. Reuben would live through his injuries, though they would make him suffer for the rest of his life. And as for the father, William James, he was among the 13 buried in that mass grave at Rock Creek Hollow. A fire was built over the brand new grave to kill the scent and keep the wolves away. The children sat and watched their mother. Sarah would record, "I can see my mother's face as she sat looking at the partly conscious Reuben. Her eyes looked so dead that I was afraid." Daughter Marianne, she said, "Imagine, if you can, my mother, only a young woman of 41, her husband lying dead in a frozen wilderness with 7 little children, starved and freezing and crying for comfort." End quote. Indeed, can you imagine what that would have been like? And then, and this is the reason I tell you the story, Sarah records what happened next. She, mother, didn't sit long. "My mother was never one to cry. When it was time to move out, mother had her family ready to go. She put her invalid son in the cart with her baby, and we joined the train. Our mother was a strong woman, and she would see us through anything." And then Marianne added this detail: "Her physical and mental endurance was nothing short of miraculous." Brothers and sisters, come with me. Go out on the Pioneer Trail, either from Nauvoo to Salt Lake or out to Martin's Cove. See the places where these things happened. They're inspiring. They take ordinary people like you and me, and they give us courage, inspiration, and strength that we can handle the challenges, difficulties, death, and discouragement that comes our way. Brothers and sisters, our pioneer fathers and mothers did it once, and our hearts are turned to them. Why? So we can do it too in our day and time. Good night.